Broadcasting from the Unshackled Studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by theunshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello everyone and welcome to the midweek edition of WilmsFront on this Wednesday, the 7th of April 2021. We are live as always on the WilmsFront YouTube and DLive channels, as well as on the enhanced interactive entropy software, where throughout the evening you can send through a question or super chat to myself or my guest tonight. It is 8:45 p.m. here in Melbourne, where we are all holding our breath with international arrivals and hotel quarantine resuming tomorrow. Third time lucky, we are hoping, for the Victorian government, given the last two hotel quarantine programs they ran ended with the coronavirus leaking and a statewide lockdown, albeit the second hotel quarantine program was much better than the first, with our third lockdown only being a snap 5-day lockdown. But on the whole, things have been much better and normal for Victoria and Victorians this past 2 weeks, as there are less and less masks around, with the mask mandate almost completely abolished in most settings. It's also been even better with Dan Andrews not in the media every day lecturing and threatening us about the threat of the coronavirus. He is continuing his rehabilitation following his fall down the stairs on March the 9th. All that we've heard from him this past month was an Easter message on his social media Facebook page, which thankfully didn't mention COVID at all. While we've suffered under Dictator Dan's decrees and rules for the past year in Victoria, over in Western Australia, Emperor Mark McGowan, whose COVID control measures were just as brutal when it came to enforcement as Dan's, has assumed absolute power post the state election, where he was re-elected in a landslide with the final two-party preferred vote, Labor 70, the rest 30%. So Mark McGowan post-election decided to also appoint himself treasurer, so he holds the two most important positions in the state, and his Labor Party controls both houses of the West Australian Parliament now, so they can pass whichever laws that they want without having to negotiate with any crossbenchers. So what has it been like living under this cult of a leader in the West this past year? Well, to get an idea and for us to be enlightened about this, my guest tonight is Andrea Tokaji, who is a human rights lawyer, advocate, and lobbyist. She lectures in law at Sheridan College in Perth. She also ran as an independent candidate for the seat of Baldivis at the just passed state election after she was disendorsed by the Liberal Party in January. She was born in Communist Romania and came to Australia as a refugee. Given her experience under a totalitarian regime based on the cult of a dictator, she has been especially alarmed at the deterioration of our rights and freedoms this past year. Andrea, welcome to WilmsFront.
Thanks so much, Tim. And this is such an imperative subject to talk about. As I was campaigning here in Western Australia, the fact that the majority of voters don't truly understand the power of their vote really struck me. It also struck me that the majority of people in Australia take their democracy for granted. And I think that has to end today. We can no longer take that democracy or our freedoms and rights under that instituted constitutional democracy for granted. We got to fight for it, and we got to fight to take back what has been stolen, and it's rightfully ours.
Well, it would have been good if it was taken back a few weeks ago for West Australians, because you've got Emperor Mark McGowan, as he's known, until March 2025 now, and the results have just been finalised, and there's obviously a full term to go, and you don't know what the state of the nation or world is going to be in the next year, the year after, since he's got such absolute power now, and the cult of the personality. Like, I heard those stories about people getting Mark McGowan tattoos. I saw all sorts of bizarre memes of him as like a buff firefighter and that it was, I just couldn't believe it. Like, I thought the cult of Dan, the Dan stands as they're known, was bad.
Yeah, look, I call him Marxist Mark for a reason. He has been instituted godlike here in Western Australia. People are saying that he saved them from COVID, and in fact, our geography has. It had nothing to do with Mark. In fact, it was almost accidental that we've had no cases. Zero. Can you believe it? 0 cases of COVID in our community transmission. 0. We have had COVID in our hospitals, on ships that have docked at our ports, but we've had no community traces of COVID. And, this has to do with our geography. He has claimed, as you rightly stated, not only the title of Premier through an election that's questionable because there was so much propaganda in media, so much fear-mongering this election, but he's also instituted himself as a treasurer. Where is the accountability? Where is the transparency, and who's going to report to who, within that process? These are real questions we should be asking as citizens. Unfortunately, we cannot blindly trust our governments. For example, the Therapeutic Goods Association, TPA, is funded, industry funded. So there is real subversive kind of agendas going on, and we need to continue asking the tough questions, not only of our parliamentarians and our government, but also the industries that are supporting the violation of our freedoms and rights under what's globally as we're heading. Obviously, this has a lot to do with the Great Reset. So yeah, a lot to talk about and a lot to do.
Now, I remember there were, as there always is, before every election, lots and lots of polls, and they were basically saying, two-party preferred, Labor 66, Liberals 33, and a lot of people saying, oh, that can't be right. It's going to be much closer towards election time. No way the Liberals will be left with just 2 seats. But that's what happened. ALP 53 out of 59 seats, Liberals down to 2, and the National Party in WA, which doesn't have a coalition with the Liberals, is the official opposition. Mark McGowan, in fact, has allowed Mia Davies, leader of the Nationals, to be the official opposition, because it's up to whoever controls the parliament to give the opposition status. And then there's also, as I mentioned, the upper house as well. WA Labor have 22 out of 40. A lot of people have been focusing on the legalized cannabis party getting 2 seats and daylight savings party getting 1, because you still have group voting tickets over there, but it doesn't really matter because Mark McGowan's Labor has control in the upper house as well.
Yeah, that's right. And even with a coalition of Liberals and Nationals in the lower house, you only have those 6 seats. And is that a strong opposition? Well, no. David Honey has been deemed the leader of the Liberals, and he has come out publicly saying that the Conservatives are responsible for the demise of the Liberal Party this election. It's our fault, that they lost the election. And I think that blame shifting is missing the point. Since Colin Barnett last election here 4 years ago, Liberals lost government tragically. The strategy this election was, let's try and take back those safe seats we once had in Western Australia. And in doing so, the left faction in the Liberal Party put forward a leader who was so left-leaning. He was releasing policies greener than the Greens, abolishing, coal industry by 2025, was an insane policy move and an announcement that lost a lot of liberal voters, liberal members, and, even candidates. But as you know, when you are part of these major parties, you cannot come out during particularly an election and debate these things and discuss them. You really have to toe the party line. So in the electorates, what choice did people have? And unfortunately, they really play on this better the devil you know rhetoric, which just doesn't fly anymore. We need the two-party preferred system that has shown themselves to not represent people to be abolished. We need stronger alternatives, and we need a strong opposition in Parliament.
Zak Kirkup, he only got the job, was it at the beginning of 2021, because Lisa Harvey was deemed to be unelectable. She resigned. Well, she was deemed unelectable because she criticised the hard border policy of McGowan, which I'm from Eastern Australia, so can you give us an idea of, because we're told from even from people in the West who disagree with the hard border that it's just so popular. Like, what is it exactly that they love about it so much, and that they just basically have blind faith in it?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. It's an illusion of safety, isn't it? Because the article for which I was disendorsed, the title is, "Are Our Fears of Coronavirus Undermining Our Freedoms?" So this is what we've seen this last year. We were so afraid of this virus that, historically we've had so many medical viruses and for example, the plague in 1917, that medically we can overcome, we can achieve, solutions for these matters. But instead of looking for solutions and instead of having a proportionate response to these matters, what we've done is we've isolated the healthy. For example, here in Western Australia, Marxist Mark suggested ankle bracelets for those who are deemed to have coronavirus. We've obviously introduced an app, and there have been so many measures, not only the civil penalties, but also the restrictions on our freedom of movement, freedom of speech, particularly in places like Victoria, that are such huge restrictions. They're disproportionate to this illness, this virus. And of course, the hard border was very much part of this. And Western Australian industry, particularly the mining industry, has definitely held up the economy of Australia under...
It's 19 hours.
During COVID and under Labor government, we have had a surplus here of over $3 billion that the Labor government is not giving account to. They are not showing us where they've invested that money in. And in fact, they haven't reinvested it into businesses that were struggling under COVID. They have in fact accepted grants from the federal government instead. So the citizens of Western Australia have a lot of questions to ask of Marxist Mark, but because of their fears, because they are blindly trusting this hard border closure, they are afraid to speak out. Businesses are afraid to speak out. There are civil penalties for businesses who do not ask their customers to sign their names in the registers. Where is this going to head? How far? What kind of measures are going to be instituted next?
And this is what I think that there's not been enough, I would say, scrutiny or alarm of not just the signing in, as you said, this move to QR checking codes. And I get a gripe with a lot of conservatives who say, how good is Gladys Berejiklian been in managing outbreaks and that and a contact tracing? Well, they're praising her centralized Service New South Wales app, where you have to check in wherever you go and it all goes into a centralized government database of where you've been all the time. And yes, that is preferable to the lockdown that we suffered in Victoria in the second half of 2020. It was as horrible to experience as it looks on TV to the rest of Australians. It was just, I wouldn't wish it upon anybody. But yes, there are so many alarming developments that are still not being given the consideration by the general public. Now, just going through this article of your opinion piece of yours, which was written in April 2020, it's 3,000 words long. But what got you disendorsed was all the way down here. If I keep scrolling here, when you talk about now, you're often misquoted saying that you believe that 5G causes coronavirus when you're asking the question. And this was in April 2020 when there was limited information about the virus. I myself have never thought that there's any evidence that 5G has anything to do with it. And when I first saw the story that you'd been disendorsed because of this section of your article, I wasn't surprised that the Liberal Party of WA had done this. Not to say that I think it was fair, but obviously I know that you've been asked about why did you bring this up, because you've when you were interviewed on Outsiders with Rowan Dean and Rita Bahani and James Morrow, a year later, because it is nearly a year to the day, do you still think it was right to put that in?
So I'm a legal academic. The way I cope is I research and read. So in the heat of lockdown, right? It's beginning of April. We've been in lockdown for a few weeks, and I'm wondering what on earth is going on in the world. So I start doing my research. I read and obviously go down a few rabbit warrens, but I discover that this 5G technology is military grade. You know, we don't know the adverse long-term health effects of it. At the same time, we're experiencing a public virus that is also a threat to our health. So this military-grade technology has been used to disrupt crowds, to affect basically the human nervous system and the immunity. If our immune system is being attacked or it's weak, we're more susceptible to viruses, right? It's logical. So my question was, number one, we're not being told about the rollout of this new technology. Number two, not even scientists understand the long-term adverse health effects of this technology. And number three, is it a good idea to roll it out right now when our health is under threat, right? And we need to do everything to boost our immunity, not to attack it. So yes, I've been misquoted. You know, yes, there was no due proper process within that disendorsement. Liberals chose not to stand up for freedom of speech. And of course, they defamed my name. I've been advocating, doing human rights advocacy for the most vulnerable in the world, women and children and exploited and enslaved. And overnight, you know, all of that's been discredited and forgotten. For what? For asking a question. Isn't that what we're meant to do as politicians, academics, and as a community?
Well, I see where you're coming from, is that in terms of the unfairness of your disendorsement and the misrepresentation of you, yeah, that's the mainstream media and a political party reacting in the heat of a campaign. But with regard to what you said, we don't know the long-term health consequences of 5G. That we don't know doesn't mean by definition that it's dangerous. And we've had, was it 4G and 3G rollout before? Nobody really batted an eyelid with that. Why of a sudden all this alarm about 5G? And I've had a 5G phone since the beginning of the year. I feel perfectly fine. I don't think it's affecting my health. And And the third thing you mentioned about why we're rolling it out during this time, the reason why, because during lockdown with people working from home, you need a really good internet infrastructure, which is not just wires and cables and 5G technology. This is the other thing. It's so visible everywhere because there's got to be lots of towers for it to travel. And so it's that as well. Yes, we don't know what the consequences are, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be as bad as what people fear. I mean, that's sort of saying we don't know the long-term effects of long COVID, so therefore we should assume that they're really bad, if you get what I mean.
Look, the technology was used in the military to take people down, to affect their nervous system. So that's what it was used for. So is it healthy for the common purpose of the public? So if you, there is a barrister at Michael Kirby Chambers who has been taking these cases to the Supreme Court, and he's about to take this case to the High Court, and he has won every time. He has doctors, he has medical professionals going to him and saying, I don't want a 5G tower outside my child's window. I want you to advocate for my case. And there is overwhelming scientific and medical evidence of the adverse health effects that he has presented to the courts, and the courts have had to agree. There have been councils who have been blocked in setting these towers up because of that evidence. So he has been a very successful barrister at presenting these matters with evidence in courts, Supreme Courts, in several jurisdictions, including Sydney and Queensland and Tasmania, and he has won every time. And now he's about to take a case to the High Court, which will set a very strong precedent, because we know that companies often put profit before people.
Well, you're true on that final statement, and if you can send me the link to that case, I'd be happy to look at it from myself, because like your article, it's worth reading it in its whole before just reading the Sydney Morning Herald headline. But as far as my own research that I've done, I see no evidence that 5G is any more toxic than any of the other technologies that we've rolled out previously. But like I said, I'm not surprised, given what you've said, why the Liberal Party did disendorse you. Again, that's not saying I think it was fair. And yes, there's no due process during election time. You've previously said you just got a call from the leader, Zak Kirkup, in January saying you're out.
Yeah, look, I don't think it was fair at all, because one of the tenets of the Liberal Party, one of their values that they stand upon, is freedom of speech. Asking questions is part of that freedom of speech and the role of not only academics but politicians. What they didn't like is the fact they couldn't control me. What they didn't like is I was asking tough questions. So we have to have a look at the biggest picture here, right? And unfortunately, it does come down to tech companies making money and putting profit before people. There are several precedents in several jurisdictions in courts across Australia that have ruled against this technology and decided that it is unhealthy for our community, and blocked major corporations such as TPG, Telstra, and Vodafone from setting these towers up, because the evidence is overwhelming. So it's not just me having an opinion or asking a question. These are courts looking at the evidence and agreeing that there is a problem.
I think they also felt that they could disendorse you because you were in what they deemed to be unwinnable seat. I mean, this was the end result for it's Baldivis. That's how it's pronounced.
Baldivis, yeah.
Baldivis. So, yeah. Well, before the election, it was, well, this is according to the ABC, very safe Labor 16 0.6%, and well, there was a 20% swing to the Labor incumbent Reece Whitby. The Liberal Party ended up going up with, was it Luke Derrick? You ran as an independent candidate and got 3.5%, which is not bad as a first-time independent, particularly with the publicity that you got. But they clearly thought, well, we're not going to win that seat anyway, so it's not going to be that that detrimental to our campaign to disendorse Andrea.
Yeah, look, I worked tirelessly. I was running a campaign, 80-hour weeks in Baldivis for 7 months. I met with communities. I advocated for a police station. I advocated for a war memorial and all of these community organizations and projects, right? And I had strong momentum and strong support. So I was excited about the results, pending results in Baldivis. And obviously I'm a local, I live in Baldivis, I grew up in a blue collar family as a refugee kid. I'm a lawyer, worked in the Attorney General's department. I've advocated for vulnerable people all my life. So, given the profile and for example, I'm not in politics for any personal gain or reason. It's a difficult game to be in, right? But I want to represent my people. I'm passionate about advocating for the most vulnerable, and I'm passionate about justice. And there's a lot of injustice in the world at the moment. So for me, those 6.5 months of campaigning was really exciting. I was getting somewhere. There was great momentum, great support in the community. And of course, after this endorsement, all my funding was pulled, all my volunteers left, and I was left to start over again 6 weeks out from election day. And Luke Derrick was one of my volunteers, 21-year-old uni student that they put forward as a candidate. And of course, the votes that he received, I wonder if it was on the momentum of my 6.5 month campaign. And, it's just the whole situation's frustrating, but that is politics. That's what happens, right?
I'd say he probably got those votes because he had Liberal Party next to his name on the ballot paper, and this is the thing as well. I've heard you talk about this before. Do people research the endorsed candidates before they cast their votes? They normally don't, unless the local member is really, really awful. There was a classic quote from Nancy Pelosi last year when she was actually having a go at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, saying, oh yeah, she's a great congressman, but she's from a safe district. I mean, this glass of water could have won in her district if it had a D next to it. And this is the thing why most people, voters in Western Australia, probably didn't pay much attention to who they were voting for. Those new Labor members who make up the 53, as far as they knew, they were voting for Mark McGowan as the emperor.
Look, that's exactly the strategy that Reece Whitby, the incumbent Labor member, ran on. So he lives in Cottesloe, one of the fanciest suburbs in Western Australia. He was a Channel 7 news reporter. He was parachuted into the electorate 4 years ago, and he kind of sees this as his retirement package, right? He's just sitting back, and when I was campaigning, constituents were saying, hey, I've seen Reece Whitby for the first time in 4 years. So that was the feedback that I was getting on the ground. And he ran some of his campaign on the back of, some of the things that I was advocating on. So, as in politics, there's a bit of copycatting going on and things like that. So there's such a disparity between who we are as people and what we stand for and why we're doing what we're doing. But as you know, and as you've articulated, when you are a conservative, when you're, in a minority party, for example, it's really difficult to get your message out there. For example, as an independent, I was shadow banned. So it was so difficult to get my message out as an independent on social media, set up the website. So how do you communicate to your constituent who you are and what you stand for? Because those things are a real challenge.
You've also spoken about Mark McGowan was pumped up to emperor status with the assistance of the mainstream media, and I don't think the media landscape in Western Australia gets the scrutiny that it needs, because over in the East, all those on Twitter are saying everything's controlled by Murdoch, but over in the West, pretty much all the media is controlled by Kerry Stokes. He owns all the newspapers there, runs Channel 7, and he was behind Mark McGowan. Mark McGowan gave him a special exemption during the hard border closure to let Kerry Stokes in. Kerry Stokes is you could call him a Chinophile. He was just basically saying, with regards to the origins of COVID, let's just forgive and forget and continue to trade with China, because he has mining interests as well. And it was also Channel 7 Perth that recently that got one of your mates cancelled, Travis Carter, his local radio show that you appeared on, and that a former MP appeared on, Charles Smith, because he made some, you'd say, sort of larrikin remarks about women. He got fired, Travis Carter, because of one Channel 7 report.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Channel 7 was relentless in continuing to bring my profile into, this whole saga. What Travis Carter stands for is freedom of speech. He had Aaron Stonehouse and Charles Smith and myself on his program a number of times, twice, and they were also candidates and they were incumbent members until recently of Parliament in minor parties, and it's important to have that alternate platform to debate and dialogue, about matters that in this very PC culture, we cannot say anything outside of the leftist rhetoric for fear of being cancelled. And if we're living in that kind of environment, we're actually living under a dictatorial, and what it comes down to is the ideology of socialism, right? Because that control is for the purpose of making sure that the leaders stay in leadership and the common citizen doesn't have freedom of speech because they don't know what they're talking about. Therefore, take that privilege and right away from them, yet because they may disturb and disrupt this leadership structure. And that's a really dangerous position to be in.
As I said in my introduction, you lived the early part of your life under communism in Romania, under the dictator Nicolae Ceaușescu,
Yes.
which, in my opinion, well, at the end of his rule, he got what he deserved with his summary trial and execution. I'm not sure if you feel the same way.
Yeah, look, Nicolae Ceaușescu was an evil man, unfortunately. He ruled with an iron fist. We were living on food rations in the 80s in Romania. So we had a loaf of bread for family for a week. What he was doing was spending all his money building palaces around the world. And in Romania, of course. If he didn't like the view outside of one of his palaces because there were peasants living there, he literally used to bulldoze villages so he could have a better view. So this is a kind of evil we're talking about here. And going back to your comment about Marxist Mark having absolute power, we know that absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there is a danger not only of giving one individual too much power, but the ideology that government can save you, that government is king and God, that government owns you. These are all really dangerous concepts because we are inalienably free men and women, right? We are born free, but through, these processes of subjugation, we become slaves to the state, or slaves to the economy, or, slaves, bond slaves, if you will, to these institutions. So it is a really difficult, complex thing to deal with. But constitutional democracies, on balance, empowering the person, right, the common person, to be part of the political process, not only as voters, but to have a say in law reform, to put their public opinion forward, and to also exercise those freedom of belief, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, right? Until recently, we've enjoyed those privileges. But under this cancel culture, under a rise in socialist Marxist ideologies coming through universities and other places, through our identity politics, it's all cutting away and eating away at these freedoms that we have taken for granted and appreciated for so long now. So the people have to push back on these violations of our human rights, because they are ours inalienably. But we are allowing the state to take them from us. It's not okay by me, and it shouldn't be okay by you either.
Well, as I said before, I lived under the stage 4 lockdown in Melbourne during the second half of last year, and a lot of Eastern Europeans who had suffered under communism in the 80s said this is all too familiar.
Yeah.
You saw how Victoria police officers imposed the health orders, and the thing I will say about Mark McGowan is that he hasn't let the masks slip to basically show his menacing side, in my opinion. Well, because Dan got up every day, and this was the other thing, that dictator Dan got up every day to tell us what basically the state of our lives was. And I always knew that he was a very nasty man inside, but you got to see his whole menacing when he was talking about protesting. He's like, it's not smart, it's not safe, it's selfish and stupid, shameful, and people wouldn't do it. And when he was asked about police brutality, it's like, none of this would be necessary if just basically people did what they were told. And it was an extremely dark time, and like we didn't know like when it was going to end. With there was the industry restrictions that came in stage 4, where there were fears that we'd run out of meat, which is another thing about communism, food supplies. And I know some Romanians in Melbourne as well, and they were like, yes, this is all too familiar.
Yep. Exactly. And so what we have is a situation where COVID has been used as an excuse to violate our freedoms and rights. Because when in history did we ever isolate the healthy? We're meant to isolate the sick. We're meant to come up with, scientific solutions to these problems of virus, right? I have huge concerns about people, businesses, individuals, communities not speaking up, not pushing back. But as you say, the threat of not only a civil penalty in terms of monetary value, but also the reputational. We're shamed in public, right? I am an asthmatic. I couldn't breathe under these masks. And apparently I had medical exemption, right? Although the doctors stopped giving those out. And if I were to take off my mask to try and breathe, because I didn't want to faint, I was told off by the next person who walked past me. How dare you put everyone else in danger? So one of the problems I had with the most recent lockdown in Western Australia by Marxist Mark was there was a alleged case of the very contagious UK strand. And for that, we were shut down for 2 weeks. There was no traces of COVID found. And I've been told that that lockdown was based on a false positive reading of COVID. So who's holding Marxist Mark to account for that? Tens of thousands of businesses have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue in a year where they needed it most. Who is holding Marxist Mark accountable for shutting us down for 2 weeks based on a false positive test of COVID? It's insane.
Or they just don't care. That's the other explanation. But that 5-day lockdown based on one case, which it didn't lead to any community transmission. He didn't just force you to wear a mask everywhere for that 5 days, but the 9-day easing period afterwards as well. Now, we've had mask mandates in Victoria in various forms since late July last year. And I know that, well, when they first became mandatory in WA and in Queensland, that you're going through what Victoria went through with the people scolding others for not wearing masks. But 6 months on, because it had dragged on for so long, there was this understanding, like before the mask mandate was finally removed in retail settings a couple of weeks ago, about half the customers at the local supermarket were unmasked, and nobody got into disputes anymore. They just respected each other's choices and mind it. But obviously at the beginning there was that conflict that you've experienced in Western Australia, but it was I think it was good by the end of it that people had just sort of realized that this we just need to respect each other.
But this is based on a nonsense, because medically speaking, these masks cannot actually prevent COVID from going through the...
And in fact, they weaken your immune system as well.
That's right. It attacks the respiratory system, right? It makes us sicker. It doesn't protect us, and it makes us unwell. So what's the point of them?
And this is what I'm worried about coming up to our winter 2021, because I did notice when I was shopping around the first week that masks can be taken off. A lot of people were actually sick with tissues and that, because I don't think they were used to breathing the fresh air and all the bugs that are around and that. So I'm really worried that because of people's weakened immune systems, that we're going to have a dark winter of other viruses and bugs here in Melbourne, because it's not COVID. It's not going to get much attention or scrutiny. And I'm not sure if you've heard about this RSV virus that is going around Australia, because we've been social distancing and in lockdown. It's weakened our immune system, particularly children, because they've been locked away. This virus is allowed to spread because everyone's been isolated. We haven't been able to build up an immune system. So we're going to see a lot of unintended consequences of masks and lockdown, social distancing this winter.
Absolutely. And I'm absolutely furious that our parliamentarians can take away our freedom to bodily autonomy, our freedom of choice, because we should be able to choose, for example, alternate, medicines and things like that, such as boosting our immune system, eating healthy food, exercising, sleeping well, and being a healthy person in general, and allowing our body to do what it naturally does, to fight these viruses. And once, I believe in herd immunity. Once our body fights it off, we're stronger for it. And we're stronger for it as a community. Marxist Mark has introduced this no jab, no play policy here. So primary kindergarten students and children in childcare centres aren't allowed to go from this week on if they haven't had the vaccine. Now, this is absolutely ridiculous, because parents have... their right to choose for their children has been violated. Parents have no other option or choice anymore. And that's not right. That's not a free democracy, and we need to push back on this and seek alternatives.
Well, because we are in the early phases of the COVID vaccine rollout, and there's been this discussion, lots of talk about whether governments or, the corporations will enforce on behalf of governments vaccine passports, or they should just be called sort of vaccine cards or passes, basically. Your state is, its Public Health Act has received a lot of attention because it grants the state the power to forcibly vaccinate people, including that provision remove their underwear. And this is, even though WA has only had a second lockdown for 14 days, it has some of the stiffest penalties. It's even sent people to jail for breaking COVID rules. You mentioned the ankle bracelets, and yes, basically they give themselves the power. And this was passed by Colin Barnett. Strip somebody naked to force them a vaccine on them, which they actually wrote that in, basically.
In 2016, Parliament, under a Liberal government, passed legislation to say that persons, any authorised person, so it could be a nurse, a doctor, or a police officer, any public servant, right? Authorised person can forcibly restrain you, forcibly detain you, and force you to take the vaccine and, strip you naked and do what they need to do to get the job done. May I ask, what about children? What about the elderly? What about disabled persons? I mean, not only is this act violating under Section 158 our bodily autonomy and our freedom to choose, but it is forcing us to restrain. I mean, what does that mean? Restrain, detain. What does that mean? Where? And what vaccine? I have huge concerns around the AstraZeneca vaccine. There's overwhelming evidence overseas, internationally, that it's unsafe. We had one woman die hours after taking the vaccine today.
Just today.
That's right. There was another person who had a blood clot. So why are we allowing this vaccine to be rolled out when it's unsafe? It's untested. And go.
It was also reported that around 50% of those who've taken the AstraZeneca vaccine report at least mild side effects. That's 50%.
50%. Even if one person has one tiny adverse effect, we should be recalling it. The problem is the TGA, Therapeutic Goods Association, is not independent because they're industry funded. We also have no choice as to other vaccines. We haven't instituted a system. We haven't exercised our free democracy. We haven't engaged the public in this debate of which vaccine should we get and how. Instead, we've rushed the whole thing. For what? Why haven't there been any reports of the flu, influenza in the last year? I looked at the stats briefly, and there are about 922 deaths of COVID in Australia in the last year. That's less than influenza last year, right? Less than influenza. And we shut down all our businesses, all services over the last year and pumped $900 billion into this exercise in, the JobKeeper and the rest of it, right? For what? Every life is precious, but the majority of these 900 persons who passed away from COVID have been elderly, statistically. And it's true internationally as well. The stats tell us they have been the elderly, they have been the vulnerable. So we are paying a very high price. Who's going to pay that debt back? And when will we get back to a normal life? Or why are they selling us this rhetoric of the new normal? What are they setting the scene up for?
Well, I think, and as I alluded to before, the contact tracing, or it's called more obvious in the UK, the track and trace, this recording your details everywhere that you go. I don't think it's going to go as far as a social credit system like they have in in communist China, but it definitely the reason why governments like surveilling, like keeping track of where their citizens are, is basically if something ever goes wrong, they can pinpoint. This is why they like giving spy agencies more powers and passing these laws to arbitrarily detain people, because they think that if something goes wrong, it's going to be really bad for them in the media and with the voters. And so the more surveillance you can have, the better. And people are just voluntarily giving away all of this information, like I mentioned before, the Conservatives saying, yeah, Gladys having this centralized database of where everyone's gone. No, that's not a good thing. It shouldn't become permanent.
I have a healthy suspicion of government, and I think we all need to have that healthy suspicion. What are they doing with all this data? Why do they need to keep a track of us? Israel is a great case study. They have instituted this social program where those who've taken the vaccine have a green card and they have access to services. Those who do not have the vaccine have a yellow card and they are shunned from community. What are we creating here? It is a social credit system.
Well,
right?
it is in Israel.
Yeah, it is in Israel, but where is it going to lead? What other countries are going to pick it up and follow suit?
And with regard to, I've said this before, but it's worth saying that it's quite unbelievable that Israel, which is a Jewish state, which was founded because they'd been made second-class citizens in Nazi Germany, would basically emulate a practice in their own country that they'd been subjected to in Nazi Germany. The mind sort of blows in that regard.
How is the green card different to the Star of David? Unfortunately, Benjamin Netanyahu has sold his people to the pharmaceutical companies, because what they're doing is they are testing their vaccines on a conglomeration of people, right? The whole nation state of Israel is under.
That's another thing that Nazis did. They used the Jews for medical experimentation as well.
That's exactly right. So we have a lot to consider. We need to deeply think about the ideologies we believe in and we follow. What values do we, love the most to live by, right? And we need to fight for those values and those freedoms and rights, because they do not come freely. Our history has told us that, right? Our history shows us, teaches us how to stand up and fight for these freedoms and rights. You know, our forefathers have fought for them for so long, and we've taken them for granted. We've fallen asleep at the wheel, to be honest, right? We've let them go to the keeper, and now there is almost full control of our bodily autonomy, of our freedoms and rights, freedom of movement, freedom of association, right? And COVID is used as the vessel or vehicle for this. So what are we going to do about it? That is the question.
And Marxist Mark, as you call him, well, he wants to emulate Dan's Marxism, he basically wants to pass the conversion therapy ban in
Exactly.
WA, which the one in that's been passed in Victoria. It's not just about health practitioners. It actually mentions banning prayer. It's extremely alarming, and yes, can criminalize private conversations between people. And as we know, Mark has absolute power now. Why wouldn't he just go with the Dan model? And that's once Dan was done with the COVID lockdowns, he went straight back to his cultural Marxist agenda.
Yeah, and look, Mark McGowan, Marxist Mark, has promised during the election that he will roll out the conversion therapy laws as per the Victoria model. And the Victoria model is the worst in Australia because it attaches a criminal penalty of up to 10 years in prison for those private conversations, whether it's prayer, whether it's advice, whether it's referral. We can't even do that for someone who's crying out for help and asking for it. Like, that doesn't make therapeutic sense, right? It bans all sorts of spiritual, therapeutic, social, or otherwise support systems that people who are questioning their sexuality perhaps require and need for a decision such as that. Surely you would need to have those conversations. You would need support, and you would need to reach out and have a fearless and frank, honest debate or dialogue and question things. And why? Why would a law be passed to criminalize this when it's there to support people and help them?
Well, as a Victorian subjected to this law now, I don't think I can answer that question.
Yeah, well, again, let's look at the ideology. It's communist, Marxist, socialist, it's about fear-mongering, it's about control, and it's about taking away those freedoms and rights of citizens. And it's creating a state where it's saying that the state is God, the state's in control, and the state owns you.
Now let's turn to your advocacy and lobbying for human rights, with a particular focus on preventing human trafficking. Now, human rights is, well, it depends on what your perspective on human rights is. Myself, with coming from libertarian principles, human rights, what I consider human rights are what are called negative rights, that things that the state or other people can't do to you, while progressives, they like positive rights, the things that the state can do for you, which basically is, well, it's getting other people, forcing them to do it for you. So first, I'd like to basically what human rights means to you, and then talk about your advocacy campaigning against human trafficking.
Yeah, sure. So before we even discuss negative human rights or positive human rights, we need to actually ask the question of where these rights come from. So I believe that we have inalienable human rights, and where they come from, I believe, is the fact that we are created in the image of God. So this theological and philosophical concept of Imago Dei means that we've been created in the image of deity, right? We have worth, we have value intrinsically since we're born. It's just there, we have it. So human rights are there, but then, as you know, when one right is upheld, another is often compromised or diminished. So when we talk about human rights, we often have to talk about both sides. So for example, the freedom of religion, like, give me the right to practice my religion. Okay, you've got that right. But the other side of that is, maybe I need to protect someone from being persecuted for having no religion, or protecting their freedom of speech to speak against my religion. Does that make sense? So it's like the opposite. And so when we talk about human rights, we have to actually observe and understand, when we're giving someone rights, are we violating another right? And when we take away a right, what right are we then giving another group? So it is a balancing act that we have to exercise. And as you alluded to before, public policy always has unintended consequences, because legislation itself cannot legislate morality. So we cannot institute through law how to love thy neighbor, basically, treat each other as we would want to be treated. So it's difficult to write everything into law. And of course, it's subject to interpretation. So then we've got all these human elements of, well, doesn't it mean this? And the debate in courts, this is what judges do, right? They redefine the law through precedent. And so it's a really tricky situation where, yes, law is written for the purpose of protecting our human rights, but sometimes in doing so, it violates other rights.
Yes, this is, as you said, it's there is this balancing act, which, well, it depends on your ideology, political philosophy about where this balancing act should go. But with regard to, yes, the reason why the principle of free speech is so important, even for offensive, grotesque, outrageous speech, is that, well, you can't pass a law that says everyone is to be nice to each other, legislate manners, or the "don't be a jerk" bill, because, well, lots of people are jerks on a daily basis. And, well, when you have laws like that, you have what is going on in the UK with the police not actually fighting actual, like, crime, violent crime, but raiding people for, what was it, transphobic tweets or something like that.
And that's a problem we have with the Anti-Discrimination Act. Section 18C talks about offend. And that is so subjective. And in law, if it's not objective and if it doesn't have a test attached to it, it's really difficult to measure. How do we measure offence, and to what degree? You know, did you hurt my feelings? You know, were there unintended consequences? For example, did I lose my job? Or, you know, what's going on? And so it's really hard to write legislation, as we're talking about, on these matters. But there are problems when we talk about subjective things like offend.
Now let's move on to talking about your advocacy against human trafficking. Now, human trafficking, there's all sorts of different types. There's, well, slave labor, and then, which is heinous enough. Then there's also sexual slavery, which is the most grotesque. So just talk about what your campaigns involve, and also just how much of this is an issue that we're not told about.
So we have more slaves in the world today than we ever have before. And unfortunately, a lot of the slavery is covert. So the majority of the world's slaves, unfortunately, are in brothels. And the youngest person that has been trafficked for sexual servitude was a 5-month-old child. So we're talking pure evil here, right? There are children sold for their virginity. You know, there are children kidnapped from their parents off the streets, from the front of their homes, for sexual servitude. This is a reality we need to face. It's happening around the world, and it's happening in Australia. Australia is a country where slaves enter into, and a country where slaves exit out of. So we have had slaves in our agriculture industry here. We've had slavery in brothels. The worst case was a Thai mother who trafficked her own Thai child from Thailand to her brothel in Brisbane at the age of 7, and she was servicing men for years until someone reported it. So it is a real situation. It is a vile human right violation on a person's being. You know, if you can imagine the subjugation, the abuse, the trauma, particularly for children and women that have to face the rape, the torture, the bashings, the brutalization, but not only that, the psychological trauma. They're often alone. They don't know who to trust. They don't know who to turn to, or what mechanisms there are to help them. And they often live in fear and in silence. So we have over 40 million known slaves in the world today, but those are just the ones we know about.
I think when you mentioned a mother who trafficked a child from Thailand to Australia, I think this is a really untold national shame. The fact that so much of the sexual slavery, particularly of children in Southeast Asia, is due to the demand in Australia, and it's basically a form of neo-colonialism. Obviously the Thailand and Philippines are some of the worst, and there's been news reports of some people in high places being arrested and charged for basically paying for disgusting child pornography in those nations. It's really, I think, something that I think our political leaders really need to say, like, this is a real problem that sadly Australia is contributing to, and we need to do more in these Southeast Asian nations to correct this.
Absolutely. And there are coalition efforts to do that. There is collaborative efforts in the ASEAN region to stand against human trafficking and slavery. So as part of our making recommendations to federal and New South Wales parliaments on our modern slavery acts. But the problem still prevails. Demand is there. I lived in Canberra for 18 years and speak to any prostitute or sex worker there, and she will tell you that she is busiest when Parliament sits. And that is not surprising given the most recent revelations of the debauchery going on in our federal Parliament at taxpayer funded, time. These people are meant to be there representing us. They're meant to be there doing a job, and instead they're indulging themselves in such perverse ways. So there is a systemic problem in our leadership, not only of our nation, but the nations, where demand is causing this slavery. And of course, we know that there are child slaves on fishing vessels. There are child slaves on cocoa plantations. There are child slaves in mines, diamond mines and the rest of them. But as consumers, we have a voice, and we can speak into this space by making healthy consumer choices, by being educated about the products that we purchase. So Baptist World Aid put out their fashion guide every year, for example. So Google the fashion guide, Baptist World Aid, and they approach every, fashion industry in Australia that provides, shoes, clothing, accessories, and the rest. And they will rate these countries based on the transparency of their supply chains and the risk of them having slavery in their supply chains. So there's a lot we can do in relation to educating ourselves, educating our neighbours, and of course, speaking up as consumers with our choices, where we put our money.
And in a, you would say, perverse way, the exposure of the basically slavery and torture of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province, and the fact that major corporations have been more than willing to cooperate with the fascist CCP up there to get their products. And you see these corporations now lobbying against sanctions or stronger laws against having slave labor from there, that this isn't an issue that has gone away. In fact, we're seeing more and more of communist China's horrendous activities coming to light, which shines a light on all of the employment slavery that's going on. Well, slave labor, I should call it.
Absolutely. And human trafficking itself is defined in the trafficking protocol as including organ harvesting. So organ harvesting goes on in China with impunity by the military. So there are military hospitals that are advertised online as being able to provide you with an organ of your choosing within 5 days. How is that possible unless they had live organs ready and waiting, live people waiting to be slaughtered? And in fact, we know that the CCP target minority groups as a way of, it's government-sanctioned genocide. It's to get rid of these minority groups by kidnapping them off the streets, illegally detaining them with impunity. These families don't often know where their family members have gone to. They're literally kidnapped for saying things against the government or being a threat to communism. They are tortured, except for around their organs. They receive a blood test and a urine sample as soon as they're detained for the purpose of these organs being harvested. And the military are making big bucks out of this. You know, we're talking $160,000 a person. And that's why we as Australians need to have responsibility to stop this transplant tourism, to make sure that, for example, if organ harvesting in Australia is an opt-out system instead of opt-in system, and that we don't have Australians going to China to these military hospitals and purchasing these organs, because again, it's the demand that is forcing this industry.
And this is why we should all be concerned about China's One Belt, One Road, which, well, our Premier here, Dan, seems to think is so important. And I mentioned Mark McGowan. He thinks that we should be friendly with China as well. And was revealed last year that our new metro trains are being made by a Chinese company that uses Uyghur slave labor. And was that Dan said, oh, the Chinese have assured me that slave labor is not being used in the construction of these trains. Yeah, it's like saying that, the Nazi Germany has assured me that they're not using Jewish slave labor in making this as well. And Dan has also said that, the Belt and Road initiative, it's about jobs for Victorians. Well, again,
Shame.
that's like saying, well, our relationship with Nazi Germany is just about jobs for us and nothing else.
Yeah. The fact remains that dictator Dan and Marxist Mark are aligned with the CCP ideology of Marxist socialism that is infiltrating the people by propaganda, fear-mongering, and control. It's taking away their freedoms and rights, and it's saying that the state owns them. So this is how they have behaved. By their fruits you shall know. This is what they've displayed to us. So these are our alarm bells, right? This is our warning. This is what these people believe, and this is who they're aligning themselves with. What are we going to do about it?
And we also see as well, sorry, I was distracted by a few comments in the chat. There's always lots of back and forth that go on there. But going to, obviously, when we had COVID arrive in Australia from China, we realized how reliant we had become on China during that time. Yeah. And I think it's something that we're slowly coming to terms with, that yes, we do need to have things manufactured here, not we don't need protectionist policies or subsidies, but we definitely need to make economic conditions better in our own country for manufacturing to take place. I think that's a positive development over the past year.
We have every opportunity to be fully self-sustaining in Australia. Instead,
it's 20 hours.
Instead, what we've done is we've sold our water to China, we've sold our land to China, we've sold our natural resources to China. We've even sold the transport and the production of these natural resources to China. So at every turn in the supply chain, they own it. And at what cost, may I ask? Why are we selling our souls? You know, it comes at a high price. Yes, in the short term, there is a monetary gain, but in the long term, it is our souls, it is our values, it is our national identity and our state sovereignty that we're selling off. And I'm extremely concerned about this.
And China knows exactly how to cause division in Australia and other Western nations through identity politics. And in the culture wars as well. Like when the Brereton report came out into alleged war crimes by Australian SAS soldiers in Afghanistan, China deliberately wanted to inflame the self-hatred, a lot of give it more of a voice, the self-hatred the left has for Australia by reposting those doctored photos of Australian SAS soldiers beheading Afghanis. So they know that, because a lot of the people who drag Australia down and want to, well, basically drag what everything this country is made from down and replace that with some sort of primitive communism. China knows that they just need to sow division on the home front.
That's right. So as a human rights advocate, I have sat in DFAT meetings, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade meetings, across from Chinese nationals and representatives, and tried to call them out on their human rights record. Their response? Look at your record on refugees. And this is not a good enough answer. And we continue to do business with these people, and we continue to invite their ideologies into our universities. The CCP have set up these Confucius schools in all of our universities. They understand, they know how to infiltrate, to subvert, and to twist and feed their propaganda into the most vulnerable, the hearts and minds of our young people. This is a real Trojan horse. And I'm sick of Australians being so ignorant to the fact that they are calculating at every turn. Communism is an ideology that takes over the economy, the psychology, the philosophy, the politics, the law, the everything of a nation. And that is what they're doing.
Trump spoke about recently in his one of his first extensive post-presidential interviews that China is laughing at the US and their cancel culture at the moment, that obsessing over Dr. Seuss books, and what is it in Australia, what is it, our lollies are racist, so are our Cocoa Pops, and our Golden Gay Chimes are homophobic.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
This is the thing
and
that they laugh at.
That's right. I watched the first press conference that the new President Joe Biden gave recently, and throughout his message was he is proud of his relationship with Xi Jinping, and they have a close relationship. Why is that a point of celebration? Why is he proud of that? I'm really concerned that one of our ally nations, we have American military on our bases here, but when it comes to the crunch and China seeks to, militarily take over Australia as they're planning to do, where will America stand? Which friend will they stand beside? Will Joe Biden stand with Xi Jinping, or will he stand with us?
And the reason why Australian political leaders have always been so reliant on the US-Australia alliance is because our defense industry and our defense procurement has been disastrous. I mean, look at what is going on with the new submarine contracts. Before that, there were those helicopters which couldn't fly at night or when it was raining. The US, obviously, they have their military industrial complex, as it's known, is way out of control. But here we could do with a bit more of it, because we can't even make the equipment properly in time to defend the homeland.
Yeah, so they're real defense questions, and not only in relation to the tools that we have, but also the effect we have in our region. And we have Australian Defence Forces, the AFP and our Attorney General's Department have been going into Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and surrounding nations in our region, the Solomon Islands, for decades now. assisting them, training them, giving them resources, tools, even staff on the ground, right? To what effect? There's a real concern in relation to if there was a military threat to Australia, who will stand with us? Are we prepared? And we militarily do rely on our allies. We just don't have the numbers. We're a nation of 24 million, even if all of us were armed. You know what I mean? How can we stand against the 2.however billion, Chinese nationals that would be prepared in an instant to lay down their lives for their nation? That's how they're brought up.
Well, if we go back to, we were talking about Israel before, even though they're only a country of 7 million, surrounded by hostile forces for the whole of their existence, every conflict, whether it be the War for Independence in 48, the Six-Day War in 67, Yom Kippur War in 73, they've repelled them at every time. But obviously the difference is their military and their intelligence is absolutely brilliant, way better than ours.
Yeah, for sure. That's
right. But it shows
right.
it can be done. Like, we're a country of 26 million. Australia has always been a country that's punched above its weight, and so there's no reason other than our own sabotage.
That's exactly right. It's this she'll be right attitude. We're too complacent. And I think that the common Australian does need to wake up and do something about the freedoms and rights that's been stolen from them.
Now, you mentioned that you spent many years inside the Canberra bubble when you were a lobbyist, and what actually has gone on in the Canberra bubble for many years has come out. The alleged rape of Brittany Higgins was the catalyst for basically how much degeneracy has gone on in that place, including the gay orgies, and then there's the allegation that a former cabinet minister, his staff has signed in a rent boy to have sex with in the parliamentary prayer room. Now, all of this is completely degenerate and disgusting behavior, but the most disturbing thing is that, it's not, I don't have much, as a libertarian, I don't have much respect for the parliament itself. It's more just they're doing it on the taxpayer's dime, on the taxpayer's property.
Absolutely. And look, they're there to do a job. How can they be doing their jobs well if all they're thinking about is the next orgy, the next party? And unfortunately, I came across this culture firsthand. It's systemic, when you're part of the major parties, there are so many wine and dine events, there's so much opportunity, let's just say, that you're exposed to, and this culture of almost expectation, right? But why is that their focus? Why are they focusing on the job at hand and taking their roles seriously as representatives of the people?
Given just how demanding a job of a politician is, you've got to deal with all these constituents on a daily basis. How do you have time for basically all of this? Well, a Parliament House is also a rumour, gossip mill, and all this time, whining and dining, having affairs and whatever not. It's like, how do you have time for all that as well? Like, we think about our normal days and it's like, well, we don't have time to just do these other normal recreational things that we want to do, let alone all these other degenerate things that these politicians do.
And can I just say that, look, bad laws are being passed left, right and centre every day in Parliament. There's a lack of debate going on about legislation that is so imperative to our freedoms and rights. Why? Because politicians aren't putting aside enough time to read the legislation. They're not turning their minds to these serious matters. They're compromising their actual role in Parliament as gatekeepers to these legislations, and instead spending their times, frolicking about frivolously. And it is dangerous because there are consequences, and we're paying for it.
It's come back into my mind now when some of the politicians have been on those live discussions, such as say Paul Murray Live when Parliament's sitting. If the bells ring, they've got to leave to go to a division. And what is it? Yep. They ring the bells for about 4 minutes or something. So they're ringing the bell, and you're like, "Oh, I've got to go. There's a division." I'm sort of like, "You've got 4 minutes to get there. How do you know what you're going to be voting on in that division? Like, you're not." Like, they don't know that a division's happening, and it's sort of like, how do you know in that 4 minutes what you're voting for or whatever? How do you know?
It's interesting because a lot of the deals that are made in relation to what legislation is going to be passed and at what expense. So, for example, the negotiations that take place for those matters often take place in the cafes of Parliament House, during the lunch hour when there is wine flowing. And, the business of Parliament extends outside of those formal proceedings. Once those formal proceedings are called, it's like everyone's already made up their minds. The factions know what numbers they've got, and who's going to win. They just go through the formal motions for the sake of it, for appearance's sake. But, those decisions are made well in advance. And often members of Parliament don't have time to review these matters in depth. And they do heavily rely on their advisors for information in relation to this. And that's another concern I've got. A lot of advisors are young. They are coming out of these leftist socialist universities with particular ideologies. And so how are our ministers being advised? That's another question we have to look at in relation to the structure of Parliament.
I think the peak of not knowing what you're voting for was when Matthias Cormann, the former finance minister, most senior West Australian Liberal, said, "Oh, our Senate team accidentally voted for Pauline Hanson's It's Okay to Be White motion due to an administrative error." And it's sort of like, you don't consider all of these Senate motions are meaningless, but they're about principles and on a matter of principle, like, you voted wrong and you blame an administrative error.
Yeah, you'd be surprised at how much of that goes on. Unfortunately, there is a lot of human error in, the day-to-day life in Parliament, because when it comes down to it, it's about communication. It's about clarity of mind around really complex issues. We cannot solve these complex issues of social, national, economic, military, matters in the short amount of time that Parliament has to sit, to debate, and to question these things in depth. So often we get these surface level conversations, and of course then we've got the media reducing that down to, a sentence or a grab, and it further minimizes the complexity of these issues. And, the common person just gets what the media portrays. So, yeah, the whole thing is fraught with human error, really.
Now, if I can segue from Matthias Cormann, he was long the most senior West Australian Liberal. He was a Conservative. He now has the job as OECD head. And now with the wipeout in the state election, and the fact that, the emerging WA federal Liberals, or the ones who are seen as who are in the cabinet, Michaela Cash, Christian Porter, and Linda Reynolds, now have clouds, sagas hanging over them. And with the electoral funding from the state election, WA Labor has so much more to war chest for the federal election. And
Absolutely.
WA loses an electorate, which is going to be the safe Liberal seat of Stirling, and WA has propped up the past three Liberal governments, well, the three terms, and it's always been a conservative or stronghold, both at the federal and state level, with its MPs at the federal level were much more conservative. Premiers Charles Court, his son Richard Court, very conservative as well. But now you have, Zak Kirkup in, 2 months, dragging the party to the far left, and David Honey, he comes across as, being a clone of that Liberal Green in New South Wales, Matt Keane.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Liberals, in general, I think, but most of all in Western Australia recently, have lost their way. They've lost their identity. They've lost their vision and their focus. And it has a lot to do with leadership. You know, last state election here, they were hit hard under Colin Barnett's leadership, and they haven't obviously recovered from that, partly due to the fact that they haven't found a strong leader. They've forgotten their conservative roots and values, and they haven't given a clear vision of where they want to head, where they want to take the nation, and what policies they value the most. And in fact, they've compromised on a lot of what they stood for. So it's really questionable whether the Liberal Party exists here anymore, to be honest. A lot of members have left because of what happened. And I've had so many members of the Liberal Party say, I have left the party because of what they did to you. So it's had a huge ripple effect.
It's certainly, when the federal election comes, I think it's going to be in the second half, or the first half of 2022, not in the second half of 2021, because Scott Morrison will want to get the vaccine rollout right, whatever that turns out to be, and is obviously a lot of his Scotty from marketing spin is becoming undone. And this is the thing, that it's people on the right now calling him Scotty from marketing, not just those on the left as well. So it's going to be another uncertain year. It's been great to speak with you tonight, Andrea. And if the mainstream media, through getting the Liberal Party to disendorse you, thought that you would be silenced, curl up in a ball and go away again, it's probably had the opposite effect, because you've had more exposure now than you did when you were just the candidate under the Liberal branding.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're not going to shut me up anytime soon. I'm going to continue to be politically active. I was campaigning for the Liberal Party for the last 14 years. It taught me a lot, but I'm ready to move on. I'm ready for new opportunities, new horizons. I'm not going to stop asking difficult questions as a legal academic. I love lecturing in law, and there's so much lobbying advocacy work to do now. And I'm just so excited to invite others to come on board with that journey, and create coalitions of support in your community, and start standing up for your freedoms and rights.
And Caldron Pool, they stood by you, and they stood by your article and you as a contributor. In fact, I think they put out a tweet saying, we've been glad with the publicity and traffic that we've got. And so this is your most recent article for them, the death of democracy in Western Australia. Well, as I said, it's got 4 years to play out. You haven't had it as bad as we've had in Victoria, but we've seen how Mark can be. We're all Australians. We're all looking out for each other.
Hear, hear. Proud to be an Aussie, proud to fight for my nation.
Take care, Andrea.
Thanks, you too. And
that's the show for tonight. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This is obviously the regular Wednesday show. I had the unexpected, or unexpected for I didn't announce that I was going to do an Easter Sunday show with James Goddard, UK patriot activist. So that has got a lot of interest and views, and I'd been trying to get him on the show for a while, so I was glad I was finally going to make that happen. Next Sunday, Brawl in the Brain returns, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time on the Unshacked's YouTube channel. Myself and Jared Stevie will return. We're probably going to be doing an in-person show, which will be exciting, and then Trad Tasman Talk returns the following Tuesday, 7 p.m. Melbourne time, also on the Unshacked's YouTube channel. Obviously, myself and Duo will be discussing the pending Trans-Tasman bubble. Well, if it goes ahead, and will it be shut down if there's any, one case community outbreaks? And WilmsFront will be back again next Wednesday, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time. New reports from Tiger Mountain by Richard Wollstonecroft continue to be published on the Unshackled YouTube channel. And of course, the unshackled.net has the entire Unshackled Productions archive and our articles and commentary as well. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on Sunday and see you again next week for WilmsFront. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to WilmsFront. Visit timwilms.com or Rational Rise TV to view the archive of episodes. And keep visiting the unshackled.net to view all our shows, and to keep up with the latest real news and analysis.